A silent cry in the darkness. Officer Daniel Brooks had driven through Oakwood Park 1,000 times before, but tonight felt different. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth after an earlier drizzle. His headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the empty benches and scattered autumn leaves fluttering across the pavement. He knew this neighborhood well. It had its troubles: run-down buildings, families struggling to make ends meet, and the growing number of homeless people who had nowhere to turn. It wasn't the worst part of town, but it had become a place where hope seemed to flicker dimly, barely holding on. Daniel sighed and rubbed his weary eyes. At 55, his body reminded him daily that he wasn't as young as he used to be. His once firm grip was now marred with calluses from decades of holding a gun, a baton, and the weight of responsibilities he had long since stopped counting. Retirement loomed ahead, but rather than a relief, it felt like a vast emptiness. What would he do without the badge? Without the uniform? He had given everything to this job, yet most days, it felt like nothing he did truly mattered. Just as he was about to pull away from the curb, something caught his eye. A figure lay curled up on a park bench, hidden beneath a tattered brown blanket. At first, Daniel thought it was just another drifter, someone trying to get some sleep before the city's morning rush would force them to move along. But something about the small, fragile shape beneath the blanket made his gut tighten. This wasn't an ordinary homeless person. Daniel turned off his headlights and quietly stepped out of the car, the crunch of his boots against the gravel barely audible in the hushed night. He approached cautiously, unsure of what he would find. The city had rules against sleeping in public spaces, and though he didn't always enforce them, he had a duty to at least check in. As he got closer, he could make out the form more clearly: a girl, no older than 14 or 15, curled up like a child trying to disappear from the world. Her face was hidden beneath a mop of tangled brown hair, her arms wrapped around her thin body as if she were trying to hold herself together. His heart clenched. A kid. Out here. Alone. Daniel crouched beside the bench, keeping his voice gentle. "Hey there, sweetheart." He didn't want to startle her. "You okay?" The girl flinched but didn't move. Her body tensed, her breathing quickening. She was awake, but she didn't respond. He frowned. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a protein bar he always kept in his patrol car. "Are you hungry?" For a long moment, she remained motionless. Then, slowly, her hand emerged from beneath the blanket, trembling as she reached for the bar. She grabbed it and pulled it close, as if expecting him to snatch it away. Daniel's chest tightened. How long had it been since she had eaten a real meal? Since she had felt safe? "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. No answer. "You got family around here?" She pressed the protein bar against her chest but said nothing. Daniel exhaled. This wasn't going to be easy. He knew that look in her eyes when she finally peeked up at him: mistrust, fear, and exhaustion so deep that it went beyond just being tired. It was the look of someone who had been let down too many times, someone who had learned the hard way that the world was cruel. And she was just a kid. "All right," he said after a pause. "I'm Officer Brooks. You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe." He glanced around the park, scanning the darkness for any signs of danger. "It's not a good idea to sleep out here. Can I take you somewhere warm?" The girl shrank back against the bench, gripping the blanket tighter. Daniel held up his hands. "Okay. No pressure. But it's getting colder. You don't have to tell me anything, but I'd really like to help." Her eyes flickered to his uniform, then to his badge. For a second, he thought she might say something, but then she curled up tighter, as if willing herself to disappear. Daniel sighed. He had dealt with plenty of homeless cases before, but this one felt different. There was something about her, something fragile yet stubborn, something that told him she had a story worth knowing. He couldn't just leave her. But he also couldn't force her. Pulling out his notepad, he scribbled something down and gently placed the paper beside her. "That's my number," he said. "You don't have to call. But if you ever need anything, food, shelter, just someone to talk to, you can reach me." Still no response. Daniel hesitated. Walking away felt wrong. But he had learned long ago that trust wasn't something you could force. It had to be earned. He turned back toward his patrol car, but as he reached for the door handle, a small, hesitant voice stopped him in his tracks. "Daniel?" His breath caught. He turned slowly. The girl's face was barely visible beneath the mess of hair, her voice cracked and unsure, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. Hope stirred in his chest. "That's me," he said gently. "What's your name, sweetheart?" A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper. "Emily." It was a name. A small step. But it was something. And Daniel knew, in that moment, he wasn't going to let this girl slip through the cracks. Not this time, the first step toward trust. Daniel Brooks had seen plenty of broken souls in his time as an officer, but there was something about Emily that made his gut tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the way she clutched the protein bar like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. Or maybe it was the way her voice had cracked when she whispered her name, as if even speaking it took too much out of her. He had a choice to make. He could walk away and hope she made it through another night. Or he could take a risk, stick his neck out, try to help, even if it meant pushing boundaries that officers like him usually didn't. Looking at her small, trembling figure curled up on the park bench, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Emily," he said, testing the name on his tongue. It felt real now. She wasn't just another nameless face in the city's long list of forgotten souls. She was a person, a kid who needed help, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. She didn't respond. She just stared at the protein bar in her hands, fingers tightening around it. Daniel crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. "Look, I know you don't trust me. That's okay. But I'm not gonna leave you out here, not in this cold. Let me take you somewhere safe. Just for tonight." Emily shook her head, a sharp, instinctive movement. "No shelters," she murmured, barely audible. Daniel frowned. "Why not?" She just shrank back, eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the park, as if afraid someone might be watching. His chest tightened. He knew that look. It wasn't just fear of shelters, it was fear of something, or someone, out there. "Okay," he said slowly. "No shelters. But I can't just leave you here." Emily didn't say anything. Her silence felt like a wall, a barrier built over years of disappointment and pain. Daniel exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand down his tired face. "All right, what if we make a deal? You come with me, just for tonight. I'll get you some food, somewhere warm to stay. No shelters, no questions, just a safe place. And if you don't want my help after that, I won't push." For the first time, Emily looked at him directly. Her dark eyes, hollow with exhaustion, searched his face like she was trying to figure out if he was lying. He wasn't. Slowly, hesitantly, she gave the smallest nod. Daniel felt something inside him ease. "All right," he said, keeping his voice calm, steady. "Let's go." He led her to the patrol car, keeping a careful distance so she wouldn't feel pressured. She hesitated at the door, her fingers twitching like she was ready to bolt at any second. "I won't lock the doors," Daniel reassured her. "You can get out anytime." That seemed to help. After a long pause, she slid into the passenger seat. Daniel got behind the wheel but didn't start the engine right away. He knew she was skittish, probably overwhelmed, so he took his time. "You like burgers?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yeah, she admitted, so quiet he almost didn't hear her. All right then, he said, finally turning the key. Let's go find the best damn burger in town. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a small, 24-hour diner on the quieter side of town. It wasn't much, just a family-run place with old booths and a neon sign that flickered on and off. But the food was good, and the people didn't ask too many questions. Emily hesitated before stepping out of the car, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Daniel walked beside her but let her take the lead inside. He knew she needed to feel in control of this moment. Inside, the warm scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. A waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, gave them a curious glance but didn't say anything as they slid into a booth. Emily sat with her back to the wall, eyes flickering toward the door like she was planning an escape route. Daniel handed her a menu. Get whatever you want. She stared at the list for a long time, as if the idea of choosing food was foreign to her. Finally, she pointed at the cheapest thing on the menu, a small cheeseburger and fries. Daniel shook his head. Make that a double with extra fries, he told the waitress. Emily's eyes widened slightly. She didn't argue, but she seemed unsure of how to react to someone offering her more instead of less. As they waited for the food, Daniel leaned back in the booth, watching her carefully. You been out here long? He asked. She hesitated before shrugging. You got anyone looking for you? Another shrug. Daniel sighed. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. But if you ever do, I'm here to listen. Emily kept her eyes on the table. For a long moment, Daniel thought she wasn't going to say anything. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "No one's looking." The words hit him harder than he expected. No one's looking. A kid, alone in the world, with no one looking for her. He didn't push. He didn't ask why. Instead, he just nodded. Well, he said, I'm here now. She didn't respond, but something in her posture relaxed just a little. The food arrived, and Emily hesitated before picking up the burger, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to eat it. Then, hunger took over, and she devoured it so quickly that Daniel had to remind her to slow down before she made herself sick. For the first time, she almost looked like a normal kid. They sat in silence for a while, Daniel drinking his coffee, Emily finishing her fries. When they finally left the diner, it was late, the streets quiet except for the occasional car passing by. Daniel walked her back to the patrol car. All right, he said, I promised no shelters. But I can get you a motel room for the night. Somewhere safe, just until we figure things out. Emily hesitated. She looked at the car, then at him, then at the dark streets stretching behind them. Okay, she whispered. It was small. But it was a step. Daniel knew this wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. A safe place, for now. The drive to the motel was quiet. The streets of Oakwood were nearly empty at this hour, save for the occasional headlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel kept glancing at Emily out of the corner of his eye, but she sat curled up in the passenger seat, her small frame pressed against the door as if she were still debating whether or not she had made the right choice. He didn't push. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially for someone like her, someone who had been let down too many times before. After about 15 minutes, Daniel pulled into the parking lot of a modest roadside motel. The neon sign buzzed, casting a red glow over the pavement. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, safe, and the owner owed Daniel a favor or two. He put the car in park and turned to Emily. You can wait here if you want. I'll just be a minute. She nodded but didn't look at him. Daniel stepped out, stretching his stiff legs before heading inside. The motel's front desk was manned by an older man named Rick, a stocky guy with graying hair and a habit of watching late-night TV at full volume. Rick glanced up from his show, raising an eyebrow. "What brings you here this late, Brooks?" Daniel leaned against the counter. "Need a room for a night. Maybe two." Rick narrowed his eyes slightly. "This about that kid in your car?" Daniel didn't answer directly. "She just needs a safe place to sleep." Rick sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You know how these things go, man. You take one in, next thing you know, you're knee-deep in something bigger than you planned." Daniel already knew that. He had known the second he saw Emily curled up on that park bench. But that didn't change anything. "I'll pay cash," Daniel said. "No names, no records." Rick studied him for a long moment, then finally grabbed a key from behind the desk. "Room 107. No guests, no trouble." Daniel took the key with a nod. "Appreciate it." As he stepped back outside, he saw Emily peering through the car window, her fingers tapping anxiously against her knee. When he opened the door, she flinched slightly, as if she had expected something else. "Got a room," he said, keeping his voice calm. "You ready?" She hesitated before nodding. They walked to the room in silence. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped aside so she could go in first. The room was simple. A double bed, a small desk, an old TV, and a bathroom with a clean towel draped over the rack. Emily lingered in the doorway. "It's yours for the night," Daniel said. "No rules, no one's gonna bother you. Just sleep." She took a cautious step inside, her eyes darting around like she was scanning for threats. Daniel set the key on the nightstand. "I'll be outside in my car if you need anything." Emily's head snapped up. "You're not leaving?" He shook his head. "Nope. Just outside. You're safe here." Something flickered in her eyes, relief, maybe, but also something else. Like she didn't quite believe him yet. She didn't thank him. She didn't say anything. She just walked over to the bed, sat down stiffly, and stared at the floor. Daniel took that as his cue to leave. He stepped out, closing the door gently behind him, then leaned against the hood of his patrol car, exhaling deeply. What the hell was he doing? This wasn't in the handbook. Officers weren't supposed to take kids to motels, pay for their rooms, and camp outside like some kind of guardian. He should have called social services, let them handle it. But he had seen what happened to kids who got lost in the system. They bounced from shelter to shelter, home to home, until eventually, they stopped believing anyone actually cared. Daniel wasn't going to let that happen to Emily. Not yet. He crossed his arms and kept his eyes on the door. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. A faint knock in the night. It was past 2 a.m. when Daniel heard it. A soft knock, hesitant, barely there. He opened his eyes. At some point, he had dozed off in his car, arms crossed, head tilted against the window. His neck ached, and the cold night air had seeped into his bones. Another knock. Daniel pushed the door open and stepped out. Emily stood there, wrapped in the motel blanket, her face half hidden behind the thick fabric. She looked even smaller than before, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "Everything okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded, but didn't move. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands together to shake off the cold. "Can't sleep?" She shook her head. He glanced back at the patrol car. "You wanna sit in here for a bit?" Another pause, then a small nod. Daniel opened the passenger door, and Emily climbed in, still wrapped in the blanket. She tucked her legs up against her chest, staring out at the empty parking lot. They sat in silence for a while. Daniel didn't push her to talk, didn't ask any questions. Sometimes, people just needed quiet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily whispered, "You're different." Daniel turned his head slightly. "How so?" Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "Most people, they don't stick around." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." She looked at him then, really looked at him, like she was trying to understand why he was still here. "Why do you care?" she finally asked. Daniel thought about that for a moment. He could have given her a dozen different answers. He could have said it was his duty as an officer. He could have said he had seen too many kids slip through the cracks. But the truth was simpler than that. "Because no one else did," he said. Emily didn't say anything. But after a while, her shoulders relaxed just a little. She didn't trust him yet. Not completely. But maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that he wasn't like the others. And for now, that was enough. Shadows of the past. The soft hum of the patrol car's heater filled the silence. The warmth contrasted sharply with the chill of the night air, and for the first time in what Daniel guessed was a long time, Emily looked like she wasn't freezing. She remained curled up in the passenger seat, wrapped in the thin motel blanket, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the fogged-up window. Daniel didn't speak. He had spent enough years on the force to know when silence was more powerful than words. Sometimes, people needed space to process things, especially kids who had been through things no child ever should. But something was different tonight. Emily wasn't just a runaway or another nameless case in a city filled with broken stories. She was a kid on the edge, hanging on to something fragile, something that could either heal or shatter depending on what happened next. She exhaled, her breath fogging up the glass again. Then, in a quiet voice, she asked, "You ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" Daniel turned his head slightly, surprised by the question. "Yeah," he admitted after a moment. "More times than I care to count." She glanced at him, wary but curious. "How come?" He sighed, leaning back against the seat. "Spent my whole life trying to be what people needed me to be. A good son, a good cop, a good man. But the longer I wore the badge, the more I started wondering if I was actually making a difference." Emily studied him, her dark eyes searching his face. "And?" Daniel chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Still figuring that part out." For the first time, the corner of Emily's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. It faded as quickly as it appeared, and her expression darkened again. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her shoulders tensing. Daniel knew that look. She wanted to say something. Needed to. But she was scared. He didn't push. Instead, he simply said, "You ever feel like that?" She hesitated, then nodded. Another pause. Then, finally, in a voice so small he barely heard it, she whispered, "I used to have a family." Daniel's stomach tightened. He didn't move, didn't react, afraid that if he did, she'd shut down again. Emily swallowed hard. "My mom died when I was 8. She said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. Car accident. One of those freak ones where a drunk driver runs a red light, and suddenly, your whole world's gone." Daniel clenched his jaw. He'd seen too many cases like that. Families torn apart in seconds because of someone else's mistake. Emily kept talking, her voice distant, as if she were reciting someone else's story. "It was just me and my dad after that. He tried, you know. He really did. But," she trailed off, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Daniel knew where this was going. He had seen it before. The grief, the struggle, the downward spiral. He started drinking, she finally admitted. Not at first. At first, he held it together. But then he lost his job. Bills piled up. He got angry a lot. Her voice turned quieter. At me, mostly. Daniel inhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want to spook her. Emily shrugged, but the movement was stiff. By the time I was 12, I knew how to hide when he was in one of his moods. He never hit me or anything, at least, not at first. Just yelling. Breaking things. Slamming doors. She swallowed hard. Then, one night, he came home drunker than usual. And I guess I wasn't fast enough. Daniel clenched his fists. He had seen the aftermath of situations like this too many times. The bruises, the broken bones, the kids who learned to flinch at every sudden movement. Emily exhaled shakily. I left that night. Just walked out the door and never looked back. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. How long ago was that? She hesitated, then murmured, almost 2 years. 2 years. 2 years of sleeping on streets, hiding in parks, running from shelters and anyone who might try to help. 2 years of being alone. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. No one ever looked for you, he asked. Emily gave a bitter laugh. Maybe at first. But my dad. I think he was relieved. One less thing to deal with. She looked down at her hands. After a while, I just stopped expecting anyone to care. Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing down the anger rising in him. No child should have to go through this. No child should have to feel like they're disposable. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. You're wrong about one thing, kid. She glanced at him warily. What's that? He met her gaze, steady and firm. Someone cares. She looked away, like she didn't believe him. But the way her fingers trembled slightly, the way her shoulders sagged just a little, told him that maybe, just maybe, a small part of her wanted to. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of her words hanging between them. Finally, Daniel said, You don't have to go back to that life, Emily. She stiffened. I'm not going into the system. I know, he said. I'm not talking about that. She frowned. Then what are you talking about? Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. He wasn't sure what he was saying, not really. He just knew that he couldn't drop her off at a shelter and walk away. You said you don't belong anywhere, he said. What if we figured out a way to change that? Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Daniel hesitated. This was insane. He was just a cop, a guy counting down the days to retirement. He wasn't a social worker, wasn't a legal guardian. Hell, he barely had a personal life outside of the job. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was standing at a crossroads that actually mattered. You need a place to stay, he said finally. I got an extra room. Emily froze. Daniel continued, It wouldn't be forever. Just, until we figure things out. Get you back on your feet. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she whispered, Why would you do that? Daniel sighed. Because I don't think you deserve to be out here alone. Emily didn't answer. She just looked away, her fingers tightening around the blanket again. For a long time, she sat in silence, staring out at the empty streets. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, Okay. It wasn't much. But it was a start. A new beginning, or just another stop. The motel room smelled like stale air and cleaning supplies. The old heater rattled as it pushed out lukewarm air, filling the space with a constant hum. It wasn't a home, but it was warm. And for now, that was enough. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the floor like she was still deciding whether or not she had made the right choice. The motel blanket was still draped over her shoulders, her small frame swallowed by its oversized folds. Daniel stood near the door, rubbing the back of his neck. He had never been great at moments like this, moments where words felt like they should mean something, but none seemed good enough. He had spent years talking down suspects, calming victims, negotiating with people on the edge. But this? This was different. He took a slow breath. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "I meant what I said. No pressure, no expectations. You stay here tonight, and tomorrow, we figure things out." Emily didn't respond, but she didn't look like she was about to bolt either. That was progress. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn $20 bill. He placed it on the nightstand beside her. "In case you need something," he said. "Food, a cab, whatever." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be outside if you need me." She finally looked up at him, her dark eyes unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but she just nodded once. It was enough. Daniel stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The cold night air hit him instantly, cutting through his uniform. He leaned against his patrol car, letting out a long breath. What the hell was he doing? Bringing a homeless teenager into his life? Offering her a place to stay? He wasn't some saint, some hero out to fix the world. He was just a tired cop, one who had spent too many years seeing the worst in people. But something about Emily had struck a nerve he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was because she reminded him of someone. Someone he had failed. A memory that wouldn't fade. Years ago, long before his hair started graying and his back started aching, there had been another kid. Her name was Riley. She had been 13 when he found her, sitting on the curb outside a gas station, knees pulled up to her chest, bruises on her arms. She had the same wary look that Emily had, the kind that told him she had learned the hard way not to trust people. Daniel had done everything by the book that time. Called child services. Made sure she was placed in a home. Followed up on her case for months. He had done everything right. And then one day, Riley disappeared. Ran away. Vanished. No one looked for her. No one cared. Except Daniel. He had searched for weeks, calling every contact he had, checking shelters, scanning missing persons reports. But she was gone. Eventually, the department told him to let it go. So he did. Or at least, he tried. And now, years later, here he was again, standing outside a motel room, watching over another girl who had no one looking for her. Daniel sighed and shook his head. Maybe he was an old fool. Maybe this would end the same way. Maybe Emily would disappear, and he'd spend the next decade wondering if she had survived or if she had ended up as just another name on a forgotten report. But maybe, just maybe, this time, he could do something right. A decision in the dark. It was past 3 a.m. when the door creaked open. Daniel had just started to doze off in the driver's seat, his head resting against the window. The soft sound of the door jolted him awake. Emily stood there, still wrapped in the motel blanket, her bare feet just barely visible under its edge. She didn't step outside. She just stood there, looking at him. He sat up. "Everything okay?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet it almost got lost in the wind, she asked, "You sure about this?" Daniel didn't have to ask what she meant. He met her gaze. "Yeah," he said simply. "I'm sure." Emily shifted on her feet. I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "The whole, not running thing." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then we figure it out together." She studied him for a long time. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. It wasn't much. But it was the start of something. A new road to walk. Dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale golden glow over the parking lot. The neon motel sign flickered off as the sky lightened, the night retreating into the past. Emily sat in the patrol car's passenger seat, her legs curled up beneath her. She was still wrapped in the thin motel blanket, but her grip on it had loosened. She didn't look as tense, though exhaustion weighed heavy in her eyes. Daniel handed her a paper cup filled with coffee from the gas station across the street. "It's not fancy, but it's hot," he said. She took it hesitantly, blowing on the steaming liquid before taking a cautious sip. She made a face. "Bitter." Daniel smirked. "Yeah, well, that's what coffee's supposed to taste like." She didn't argue, just cradled the cup between her hands as if the warmth was more important than the taste. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable but full of unspoken thoughts. Daniel let her sit with it, knowing she needed time to process everything. He could see the internal battle playing out behind her tired eyes. She was trying to figure out if this was real. If he was real. If she could actually trust him. "Still sure about this?" she asked, voice quiet. Daniel turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. "You got somewhere else to be?" Emily hesitated before shaking her head. "Then yeah," he said. "I'm still sure." The first step toward a new life. Daniel's house wasn't much, a small, single-story home on the edge of town. It had a front porch that needed repainting and a mailbox that leaned slightly to one side. But it was home. It was quiet, safe. As he pulled into the driveway, Emily shifted in her seat, eyes scanning the house with wary curiosity. "This is it?" she asked. "This is it," Daniel confirmed, putting the car in park. Emily didn't move. Daniel turned to her. "You don't have to stay," he reminded her. "But the offer's real. A warm bed. A locked door. No one to bother you." She didn't look at him. Her fingers played with the frayed edge of the motel blanket. After a long pause, she whispered, "I don't know how to be around people anymore." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That's all right. You don't have to figure it all out today." Emily still didn't move. "You hungry?" he asked, changing the subject. She glanced at him suspiciously. "Why?" Daniel smirked. "Because I make a mean stack of pancakes." A flicker of something, maybe amusement, maybe disbelief, crossed her face. "You cook?" Daniel scoffed. "Kid, I've been feeding myself for 55 years. I'd be dead by now if I couldn't." Emily's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. That was enough for him. Home, at least for now. Inside, the house was simple. Modest furniture. A wall lined with books. Framed pictures that hadn't been dusted in a while. It wasn't fancy, but it was lived in. Emily stood in the doorway, shifting awkwardly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed inside. Daniel set his keys on the counter. "Guest room's down the hall," he said, pointing to the only door that wasn't his bedroom. "Bathroom's across from it. Help yourself to whatever's in the kitchen." Emily remained in the doorway, gripping the blanket. Daniel watched her for a moment before stepping past her toward the kitchen. "You want chocolate chips in your pancakes or just plain?" She frowned. "You have chocolate chips?" He shrugged. "I was a kid once too, you know." She hesitated. Then, finally, she stepped inside. Daniel didn't react. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just turned on the stove and started mixing batter, as if this was all normal. Because maybe, for the first time in a long time, it could be. Breaking old habits. That first night was tough. Emily barely spoke during dinner. She ate quickly, almost mechanically, like she was afraid the food might disappear if she didn't finish it fast enough. Daniel didn't say anything about it, but it hit him in the gut. She didn't shower. Didn't change into the clean clothes he left for her. When she finally went to the guest room, she didn't sleep in the bed. Instead, when he peeked in a few hours later, he found her curled up on the floor beside it, still wrapped in the motel blanket. Daniel sighed but didn't wake her. Instead, he grabbed an extra pillow from his own room and placed it beside her on the floor. He left the door open just a crack so she wouldn't feel trapped. It was going to take time. But she was here. And that was a start. Old demons, new promises. The next morning, Daniel found Emily in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot as if it had personally offended her. "You trying to make it start with your mind?" he asked, grabbing a mug. She scowled. "It's taking too long." Daniel smirked. "That's coffee for you." She folded her arms. "Still bitter?" "Always." She hesitated. "You got milk?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You putting milk in my coffee?" She shrugged. "I wanna try it." Daniel shook his head but grabbed the milk from the fridge and poured some into her cup. She took a cautious sip, then nodded. "Better." Daniel chuckled. "You're high maintenance, kid." She smirked slightly. "Yeah, well, you asked for this." Daniel took a sip of his own coffee, watching her over the rim of his mug. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I did." For a moment, everything was still. Peaceful. Then, Emily's expression darkened. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. Daniel sighed, setting his cup down. "That's up to you." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You can stay," he said. "For as long as you need. Or if you want something more permanent, we can figure that out. But whatever happens next, you don't have to do it alone." Emily stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was lying. When she didn't find one, she exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Daniel nodded. "That makes two of us." A pause. Then, "Okay," she whispered. And just like that, a new chapter began. For both of them.